Hi. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through a modified surface toolbar. So let's just go through features. First of all, we have to enable this checkbox. Modify surface is off by default. Let's call this lake and add this spline to the water list. Okay, so we have a lake on the list. The template is set to the reservoir. We have three options here. We have a lake, a reservoir, and a pond. I'll get through each one of those. So let's generate and see what happens. Okay, so Cityscape Pro has created a reservoir. It has a depth of 6 meters, and you can notice that there's also water geometry that's been generated. That's because there was a water fill selected. If we uncheck this checkbox and generate again, water geometry won't be created, and the user has the option to manually create a water geometry. Okay, let's bring back the water, and you can see that there's -1 meter. The water geometry's offset from the surface down by 1 meter. You can increase the value if you'd like to. Let's move to Lake Template and see what happens. Okay, so they can see that we just isolate the surface object. The lake has been created. And we also have a water geometry. And the third option would be a pond. The pond looks like a lake, but it has a more gradual slope. The angle of the slope is less steep. One thing to notice is that the surface has a lake, but because the curved area is based on the surface object, it is following the lake as well. That's something to keep in mind. Typically, you probably need to make the lake inside of the curved area. Probably something like that. We generate now. Render. So obviously, you wouldn't have a lake on sidewalks, so it should be grass or sand material. Let's take the sidewalk, remove the sidewalk, and let's just generate. Now it's grass and there's a lake inside. It's a little bit strange. So what we can do is we can add sand material to the curved area, and I guess it would make more sense. Okay, now we can have multiple water areas. Draw a spline here. A circular spline. We can keep our lake as this, and we can create. Let's make it reservoir and call this a reservoir. Okay, let's generate. So you can see that there's that reservoir here with a separate water geometry. Now let's make things a little more complex. Let's take this larger site and create a lake in the middle. Draw a circle. Call it lake. Pick this in the Modify manual, enable Modify Surface first, add the water. Okay, let's make it a lake, make it a little bit deeper. Like it 12 meters. Generate. Okay, so you can see that has created a slope and there's water inside. So, again, the way it works is that the actual lake is created on the surface object. The original surface object that would provide to Cityscape gets modified, but in a non-destructive way, which means that when you enable Modify Surface checkbox in Cityscape, and when you generate there's a new modifier applied to surface object, which is called Cityscape Surface. Cityscape Surface stores all the geometry edits, and it regenerates every time there is a change. So if we turn off the Cityscape Surface, you can see that we have the original mesh. If we bring it back, you can see that there's a modified mesh with a lake built in, and the curved area, it just follows the surface. Okay, so if we go back to Cityscape, you can notice that we have a terrain list at the bottom. Terrain works in a similar way, just instead of water. It adds a terrain information. We can add a circle and let's explore our options. In terrain we have 3 templates. The first one, it's a hole. It can be useful for creating holes that are going through the whole site. Let's just generate and see what happens. Okay, so this is the hole that is created. So you can see that this hole goes through a surface object as well as curved area. Let's isolate the surface object again. And now the Cityscape Surface modifier not only keeps the lake information, it also keeps the new terrain data. If we turn it off, we're getting the original mesh. Even if you have the Cityscape Surface modifier applied, you can still modify the original mesh. You can change the terrain. When you bring back the Cityscape Surface, it won't update yet because Cityscape Surface is just keeping additional mesh that has the changes incorporated into it. So if you want Cityscape to apply the new changes that you just did to the mesh, you need to regenerate. You can see that it has already detected a change. It has started flashing. Okay, so now you can see that even if you turn off the Cityscape Surface object, the mesh underneath, it's identical in terms of terrain information. Okay, so now what we can do is we can explore what's the other options in the terrain. So we looked at the hole, we have a berm here, the berm has the height parameter and the slope angle. Slope angle by default is 18 degrees. But you can modify it. Let's just isolate the surface. This is our berm, it's probably a little too low for the side, so we can make it higher. We can increase the slope angle. So let's make it 20 meters and let's make the slope angle 25. Okay, now you can see that it looks very different. Let's explore other options in the terrain. So, hole, berm, and then there's a terrain depression, which means that it's very similar to the berm, but It just goes inside of surface, just the opposite way. So we can give it a depth of 20 meters. And the same slope angle. Let's generate and see what happens. The curved area is following the surface. So let's go back to Surface Object. When you use the Modify Surface, and it's enabled, Cityscape Surface Modifier gets applied to Surface Object. Cityscape Surface Modifier stores the new generated mesh data, as well as mapping information. So if you use Modify Surface, you don't need to apply any additional mapping to the surface. Everything is created automatically. One more important thing is that if you'd like to modify this surface object, you can do that underneath the Cityscape Surface Object. You can apply Edit Poly, and if we turn off that Cityscape surface for a second, you can do all kinds of modifications. Again, we go up and turn off the Cityscape surface. Those changes won't be visible yet because it hasn't been generated yet, but it's very important to keep all the modifications under the Cityscape surface. If you apply any kind of modifier on top of the Cityscape surface, it will be lost on the next generation.